To many, he is a myth, a legend, and the inspiration behind some of Hollywood's most iconic movies, such as Scarface, The Untouchables, and The Godfather.
You found paradise in America.
However, for those who lived in Chicago during the 1920s, the man popularly known as Scarface was a figure who terrorized law enforcement, rival gangs, and every household. A notorious gangster who ruled the streets of Chicago. In his prime, Al Capone wasn't one to be messed with. King of Chicago's underground world, he was involved in all kinds of criminal activities, from gambling, prostitution, bootlegging, bribery, narcotics trafficking, robbery, protection rackets, and even murder. Nothing illegal happened in the city without his knowledge. But in the end, the man who rose to become one of Chicago's, and, in fact, America's most famous criminal lord, went crazy. And by crazy, I mean really crazy. It was so bad that doctors even described his mental capacity as that of a 12-year-old. This is the story of the rise and fall of Al Capone, from mafia boss to crazy person. Alphonse Gabriel Capone was born on January 17, 1899, in Brooklyn, New York. His parents were Italian immigrants who moved to the United States in 1893. His father, Gabriele, was a barber, and his mother, Teresa, was a seamstress. He attended a Catholic school and was a decent student, although he struggled with how strict the school's rules were. From a young age, Capone wasn't exactly the kind of kid who played by the rules, as he was always getting on the wrong side of the law. When he was 14, he was expelled from school for hitting a female teacher in the face. On his expulsion from school, he turned to the streets where he met Johnny Torrio, a notorious New York gangster who would eventually become his mentor, introducing Capone to a life of crime. Torrio was the street gang's leader, a gang that also included Lucky Luciano, who would later attain independence and gain notoriety. Basically, this was the biggest gang in their street, and Capone absolutely loved the street life. As a teenager, Capone worked for a number of small gangs, including Junior 40 Thieves and the Bowery Boys, the Brooklyn Rippers, and then the powerful 5 Points Gang, based in Lower Manhattan. During this time, fellow racketeer Frankie Yale, a bartender in a Coney Island dance hall and saloon called the Harvard Inn, employed and mentored him. It was in this bar that he had an encounter that changed his life forever. The reason why he was called Scarface. One day, during his shift in the bar, he insulted a woman while working the door and was slashed 3 times on the left side of his face with a knife by the woman's brother, Frank Galluccio. The wounds resulted in the name Scarface, a name that he absolutely hated. He would often try to hide the scars in photographs. His closest friends, however, called him Snorky, and that's because he was a good dresser. When he met Capone, Johnny Torrio was trying to transform the business of organized crime from a dirty street hustle riddled with violence to a corporate one. Capone would then begin working alongside Torrio for some of the most notorious gangs in New York. In 1919, Al Capone moved to Chicago at the invitation of Johnny Torrio, who was at the time working as an enforcer for James Big Jim Colosimo. Colosimo was one of the biggest bosses in the Italian-American organized crime syndicate. If you understand how the mafia operates, you will know that the enforcer is a really important position. So, Torrio was closer to the top of the food chain. In Chicago, Capone took up the job of a bouncer at a brothel, and it is suspected that it was in this brothel that he picked up the disease that would result in his mental instability in later years. He contracted syphilis, but instead of treating the infection, he ignored it and never sought a cure. Meanwhile, under mysterious circumstances, Colosimo was murdered in 1920. And Torrio took over as the boss of the largest organized crime group in the city. Rumor has it that Al Capone was involved in the death of Colosimo, but it was unconfirmed. In his time, Colosimo refused to be involved in the bootlegging business, but when Torrio took over, he began involving his group in the operations of the illegal alcohol industry. Torrio was now the head of an Italian organized crime mob that was the biggest in Chicago, and Capone was his right-hand man. He didn't want to get drawn into gang wars, which were very common among the mafia, so he negotiated agreements over territories with rival gangs. But when it was discovered that Torrio secretly arranged for the murder of Dean O'Banion, the leader of the North Side Gang, at a flower shop on November 10, 1924, Torrio, who was previously perceived as a man of peace, was now a target. O'Banion's successors made it a priority to avenge their late leader. In January 1925, Al Capone was ambushed, but he escaped unhurt. But 12 days later, Torrio was shot several times while returning from a shopping trip. Fortunately for him, He survived, but he was so shaken by the incident that he chose to resign from the gang, effectively handing control to Al Capone. At the age of only 26, Al Capone became the leader of the biggest Italian crime group in Chicago. He was the boss of an organization that sold illegal liquor, with a network that spread all the way to Canada and connections in politics and law enforcement. His methods were brutal, as he used violence to increase revenue. Any establishment that refused to purchase liquor from Capone would mysteriously get blown up, and as many as 100 people were killed in such bombings during the 1920s. Rivals also believed that he was responsible for the spread of brothels in the city. He was known for his flamboyant lifestyle and wore custom suits with costly jewelry. He was also often accompanied by the most exotic female escorts. Capone turned Chicago into the hub for mafia activity in the 1920s and ruled with an iron fist. He was extremely wealthy, with a far-reaching network of mobsters. Capone was a typical gentleman mobster who always used a middleman and was always in the right place at the right time. He never went anywhere without an armed detail, although he never carried a weapon himself. But during his time, several attempted and successful hits were carried out in Chicago. The streets of Chicago were red hot. He had built a fearsome reputation among the mafia, a reputation that grew as rival gangs were eliminated or nullified. At the height of the violence that engulfed Chicago in the 1920s was the St. Valentine's Day Massacre on February 14, 1929, where 7 members or associates of a rival gang, the Bugs Moran mob, were machine-gunned against a garage wall by rivals posing as police. The massacre remains one of the most notorious gang-related murders in American history. Many believe that Al Capone was the man behind the massacre, although Capone himself was in Florida at the time. The rumors were fueled by the type of man he was. Al Capone had a reputation for ordering men to do his dirty work for him, as he rarely ever got his hands dirty. He was a boss, and bosses only gave orders. By this time, the FBI was after him, but the Bureau couldn't do much as they needed a federal crime to hang a case on him, and they didn't have enough evidence. He was well known for evading charges, and whenever he came up as a suspect, there was rarely any evidence to pin the case on him. The police were increasingly frustrated, and several times they raided his brothels and gambling dens. Al Capone would often willingly give himself up to be arrested, but since there was no evidence, the Chicago police had no choice but to release him. Charles Schwartz, a writer for the Chicago Daily News, dubbed Al Capone and his criminal gang the Untouchables. He was so untouchable that he moved the headquarters of the gang to Cicero, Illinois, where he and several of his men both intimidated and bribed their way into public offices. Now public office holders, they were able to set up many more racketeering businesses, making it harder for their perpetual enemy, the rival North Side Gang, to eliminate members of Capone's outfit. Capone tried to maintain the image of a respectable businessman and a contributing community member. After an attempt on his life, he tried to make peace with rival gangs, but it fell through, forcing him to move his family to Miami, Florida, where he purchased a 10,000-square-foot mansion from the Anheuser-Busch family. Without a doubt, he was a very wealthy man, with an estimated net worth of $100 million in 1927, equal to $1.7 billion today. Finally, the opportunity the government had been waiting for came on March 27, 1929, when he was arrested by FBI agents as he was leaving a Chicago courtroom after testifying to a grand jury that was investigating violations of federal prohibition laws. He was charged with contempt of court for failing to answer a previous subpoena and was sentenced to 6 months on that charge. But before he served his time on that charge, Capone and his bodyguard were arrested in Philadelphia for carrying concealed weapons. He was sentenced to 1 year in Pennsylvania's Eastern State Penitentiary, where he served 9 months before being let off early for good behavior, and was released in March 1930. But a week after his release, Capone was listed as the #1 public enemy on the unofficial Chicago Crime Commission's widely publicized list. However, that was only the beginning of his troubles, as the U.S. Treasury's Special Intelligence Unit had started compiling a tax evasion case against him. For years, the government was unable to prove that he was orchestrating gambling, protection, prostitution, and bootlegging rackets. Instead, they decided to focus on the fact that he wasn't paying taxes on his income from those rackets. Being the lavish spender that he was, it was clear to all that Capone had to have a substantial income to support such a lifestyle that was way above his taxed income. On October 18, 1931, Al Capone was convicted of tax evasion and sentenced to 11 years in federal prison. He was sent to the Atlanta U.S. Penitentiary, where he was first formally diagnosed with syphilis and gonorrhea. He also suffered perforation of his septum and withdrawal symptoms due to his addiction to cocaine. In 1934, he was moved to Alcatraz, where he played banjo in the prison band, the Rock Islanders. Al Capone's health worsened during his time at Alcatraz, and he spent the last year of his time in prison in the hospital wing. In 1938, prison doctors diagnosed him with syphilis of the brain, a condition that mimics dementia in its effects. According to doctors, his mental capacity was that of a 12-year-old during this time. Based on his poor health, at his wife's appeal, he was released in 1939. He retired with his family to his Florida mansion, where he died from heart failure in 1947 at the age of only 48. He was laid to rest in Chicago, the city he once ruled. If you enjoyed this video, kindly hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more. We'll see you in our next video. Bye.